The road faded in and out of view through the morning mist, the car's tires rolling over damp earth, splattering mud in its wake. The air carried a faint scent of decay, damp wood, and long-forgotten soil. Through the windshield, the silent village slowly emerged from the fog, its low houses lined up in orderly rows. Each building bore the weight of time, their rooftops blanketed in moss, wooden doors weathered and peeling, as if the entire place was being slowly consumed by time itself. I pulled over and stepped out. The cold wind crept into my collar, carrying the scent of wet soil and rotting leaves. The village was unnervingly quiet, no children laughing, no dogs barking, not even the rustle of leaves in the breeze. As I walked into the village, I could feel them. Eyes. Watching me from behind curtains, through cracks in the wooden shutters. Silent, wary, as if I were an intruder in a place where no outsiders were meant to tread. Most of the houses were built in the early 20th century style, a blend of brick and timber that had aged into a solemn, almost mournful appearance. Only the church tower stood taller than the rest, its silhouette faint in the mist, like a gravestone overlooking the village. I followed the stone-paved path, the damp surface meeting my footsteps. Each step felt intrusive, as if this road had not been walked in years. Then, something caught my eye. Pinned to the village's notice board was a faded missing persons poster. The paper was crumpled, its edges frayed and water-stained, yet the photograph remained visible, barely. The child in the image had no smile, their eyes disturbingly hollow, as if they had already foreseen their fate. A sudden gust of cold wind sent a shiver down my spine. I turned away from the board and saw her, an elderly woman, standing just beyond the next corner. She was hunched, her frail figure barely filling the doorway of a half-open wooden house. Her deeply wrinkled face bore an expression I couldn't quite place, pity, perhaps, or something darker. Our eyes met for only a second. Then she looked away, her dry, cracked lips trembling, as if she wanted to speak. But she said nothing. Instead, she turned and shuffled back inside. The door creaked, then slowly shut. I exhaled, shaking off the unease. Just as I prepared to move forward, a faint rustling sound caught my attention, the whisper of paper against stone. I looked down. A yellowed scrap of paper had been carried by the wind to my feet. I bent down and picked it up. Only one sentence was scrawled upon it in unsteady handwriting. Go to the old house. My pulse quickened. A slow, creeping dread crawled up my spine. I lifted my gaze toward the village's outskirts. The mist was thicker there, clinging to the distant trees like a veil. Something was waiting. The old house sat at the village's edge, half consumed by creeping vines and wild overgrowth. It looked like a corpse abandoned by time, its walls split by deep cracks, its wooden beams rotted through. A portion of the roof had collapsed inward, revealing a jagged, blackened void. The door was ajar. I stepped inside. The scent of mildew and decay hit me instantly, wet wood, dust, and something deeper, something wrong. I raised my flashlight. The beam sliced through the darkness, casting long, shifting shadows along the dust-laden floor. The furniture was in shambles, chairs knocked over, the table thick with untouched dust. Torn pages and brittle letters lay scattered across the floor, forgotten remnants of a time that no longer existed. The walls were worse. The paint had peeled away entirely in places, revealing dark wooden panels beneath, panels that bore long, deep scratches, as if something had clawed at them with desperate, human hands. A feeling settled in my chest. This house had seen suffering, and the traces of it were still here, whispering through the silence. My steps creaked against the wooden floor. Then, in the farthest corner of the room, I saw it. A broken wooden chest. Its lid was partially open, swallowed in shadows, like a gaping maw. I knelt down and reached for the cover, pushing it open. My fingers brushed against damp fabric. Beneath it, an old, yellowed photo album lay undisturbed. My breath slowed. I turned to the first page. The photographs had faded, their edges curling with time. The children in the images stood in neat rows, staring straight ahead. Expressionless. Lifeless. There were no smiles. Only a haunting stillness. As if, in the moment the picture was taken, their lives had already ceased to be their own. I stared at the faces of the children in the photograph, and for a moment, my heart stopped. They looked familiar. A creeping unease coiled around my spine. I flipped to the last page, my fingers trembling. A date was scrawled beneath the photograph, 1920. My breath hitched. The faces, the contours, the vacant eyes, the curve of their lips. They were identical to the children on the missing persons poster in the village. I snapped the album shut, my heartbeat hammering in my chest. A whisper, faint, distant, carried by the wind, like children murmuring just beyond the edge of perception. I forced myself to breathe, to calm down, but the air inside the house had grown heavy, thick with something unseen. Then, a sound. A soft click from above. Like a floorboard creaking beneath someone's weight. I froze. The beam of my flashlight trembled as it traced along the ceiling's cracked surface. Something was up there. Watching. The air turned ice cold, and my fingers twitched involuntarily. Slowly, I stepped backward, my movements careful, measured. I didn't want to make a sound. Just as I reached the threshold, my flashlight skimmed across the wall beside the door. Scratched into the wood, deep and uneven, as though carved by desperate fingernails, were 4 words. "Take us home." The village air was thick with dampness, a suffocating pressure settling over the world as if an unseen shadow had draped itself over everything. I flipped through the old photo album again, my hands cold, my fingers trembling against the edges of the yellowed pages. The children's faces were blurry, distorted by time, yet their hollow gazes remained, as if they were trying to reach out through the photograph, trying to meet my eyes. I needed answers. But there were none. The official records held nothing. No mention of disappearances. No trace of these children. It was as if they had never existed. Someone had erased them. Then, in the abandoned church, I found something. A journal. Its leather cover was cracked and brittle, the ink inside bled into the yellowing pages. The handwriting was jagged, erratic, as if written in fear. "Burn it, the fire can cleanse sin, but it cannot break the curse." The final page was nearly destroyed, marred with deep scratches, as if someone had clawed at it in desperation. I wiped away the dust, revealing the last words that remained. On the birthday. Midnight. A knock at the door. Soft. Delicate. Like a child gently rapping their knuckles against the wood. The sound cut through the silence like a whisper in a graveyard. I held my breath. Slowly, my fingers reached for the lock. Then I stopped. Through the peephole, I saw him. A child. Standing at the end of the hallway, his shadow stretching long under the dim light. He wasn't moving. His face was hidden in the darkness, but I knew he was looking at me. Something squeezed around my lungs, an invisible hand crushing my ribs. I stumbled backward, my breath ragged. The child lifted his arm and pointed. Not at me. At the window. I turned slowly. In the glass, my reflection stared back at me. But behind me, the child's shadow had appeared. A cold wave of terror crashed over me. I bolted. The door flew open, and I tore down the hotel stairs. No footsteps followed. No sound. As if he had never been there. But he was. He had always been there. Waiting. I didn't stop running. The map I had found earlier burned in my mind, the only clue I had left. I ran toward the forest. The mist between the trees was impossibly thick, swirling like something alive. The air reeked of damp earth and rot, the decay of things long buried. The trees, They weren't swaying in the wind. They were watching. And in the distance, the whispers began. Low. Murmuring. A chorus of voices, whispering in a language that didn't belong to this world. The orphanage finally emerged from the mist, a crumbling relic of the past, its shattered windows and vine-strangled walls standing as a testament to abandonment. The air reeked of mold and decaying wood. The moment I pushed the door open, an icy chill ran down my spine. Inside, scattered old toys and broken school desks littered the floor. The walls were covered in children's handwriting, scribbled words, uneven and desperate. "Take us home." I took a cautious step forward. The wooden floor groaned beneath my weight, as if protesting my intrusion. At the far end of the hall, a faded picture frame hung askew. Within it, a sepia-toned photograph captured a line of children standing motionless, their vacant expressions framed by the orphanage's imposing black doors. My gaze caught on a figure in the corner of the photo. A familiar silhouette. The same child from the hotel hallway. He wore the same clothes, bore the same unnervingly stiff expression. And his hand. It was reaching out from the photograph. I spun around. The room had filled with shadows. Small figures stood in the corners, their hollow faces blurred by the dim light. Their mouths hung slightly open, whispering, "Take us home." Fire. Only fire could end this. With shaking hands, I pulled out my lighter. I struck the flame and pressed it to one of the brittle photographs on the table. The fire caught instantly, devouring the dry paper before spreading to the stack of albums and wooden furniture. The whispers turned to screams. The shadows convulsed in the firelight, writhing, clawing toward me, but the flames formed a barrier between us. The orphanage groaned as the walls began to collapse. The figures on the walls twisted in the fire's glow, as if they were trying to escape. Thick smoke filled my lungs, burning my throat, but I forced my way through the suffocating heat and hurled myself out of the doorway. I hit the damp earth just as the building was fully consumed by fire. Lying there, I watched as the orphanage burned. When I returned to the village, everything had changed. The villagers no longer remembered the missing children. They didn't remember me. The hotel owner greeted me warmly, as though I had just arrived, as though I had never been here before. Every trace of what had happened erased. The past rewritten. I returned to Berlin and handed the photographs to my editor. But when he opened the album, the pages were blank. I tried to explain, to make him understand what I had seen, what I had lived. But no one believed me. And then, the dreams began. Each night, I found myself in the mist-shrouded forest. The children would emerge from the shadows, stepping toward me, their vacant eyes locked onto mine. Their lips moved in slow, silent whispers, repeating the same plea. At midnight, the knocking started. Soft. Gentle. Like a child tapping at my window. I tried to ignore it. Tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. But sometimes, I couldn't help but look outside. The street below lay silent, swallowed by the night. But in the shadows, just beyond the edge of the streetlights, there was always a figure. Standing still. Watching. Waiting.